Seguro que sí. You do know that in Boston, one unique feature of Boston are the traffic rotaries, right? All those traffic rotaries that they are created to avoid busy intersections. Marcela's work has so much intersectionality with JSI's work that we would, if we were to work with her, we would have to be like a rotary to bring her in. She writes about Latinos, she writes about social determinants of health, she writes about immigration, she writes about equity. She is very talented. She started as she was a Telemundo reporter. You may have seen her in WGBH and and NBC. She's the first Latina to be on the editorial board of the Boston Globe, and perhaps one of the first in the nation. Today, she's here to talk to us about two topics that we never think about, that we never think that they will cross with each other, right? Climate change, as you know, we have a climate change business group. Thank you, Terry Green, she's our director. And then, of course, we work lots with immigrant populations and with Latinos. So she's going to be here with us for only like 30 minutes. So without much ado, let's welcome Marcela. Marcela, bienvenida.
Thank you so much, Rudy, for having me and for inviting me to talk about this. I'll do my best to try to shed some light into this intersection that you rightly mentioned. Before I share my thoughts on this topic, which obviously these thoughts are naturally informed by my reporting and writing as a columnist at the Globe, I wanted to tell you something quick about me, who I am and how I get here. I'm originally from Mexico. I'm an immigrant myself. I was born and raised in Monterrey in northern Mexico. I sort of started my career there right before I was going to graduate from college, but I major in something different. I'm technically an economist, but I've never worked in that capacity. So I don't think I need to stop calling myself that. About 20 years ago, I moved to the Boston area because I wanted to get a graduate degree in journalism, which I did eventually from the Harvard Extension School. My first job as a journalist here was in Spanish language newspaper. That was about 15 years ago. Because of that, I spent a fair amount of time covering Latino and immigrant communities in Boston and in the state, but also at a national level, following major policy issues that is of interest to these communities. Then I sort of crossed over, like Rudy said, to the so-called mainstream media, a term that I really don't like, but I can't think of a better one. I freelanced for a few outlets, including the Boston Business Journal. I did some TV, which I didn't like. And then I landed at the Boston Globe at the opinion and editorial pages at the Boston Globe. When I got hired there nearly 8 years ago, like Rudy said, I was the first Hispanic, first Latina, first Latino ever being hired at the editorial pages. In fact, I still am. I'm still the only Latina there. The editor of that department hired me because I brought this sort of, he thought that I brought this wealth of knowledge that I had accumulated, right? Sources, expertise, a window into the Latino world in the state, in Boston, that as a group obviously was and probably continues to be very much underreported in terms of the news. We don't cover it. We don't understand a lot of the things going on in Latinos. When I'm sure as you probably know, when immigrants as a group are reported on or covered in the news, if at all, generally they tend to be painted with one big brush, one dimension. We're a homogeneous mass of people, right? Or we're just looked at from the perspective of, politics, like in presidential elections. Oh, how is this block of people going to vote, or in the context of immigration reform, et cetera. So again, at the Globe, what I've tried to do, like Rudy said, is to dispel that notion, right? To peel back the many layers, the many truths that migrants and Latinos and Latinas carry. These are rich truths. These are complicated truths. sometimes ugly truths, because it's just the human experience, right? So my goal has always been to uplift underreported issues that affect the lives of Hispanics from a nuanced and thorough perspective. That's what I like to call, that's why I like to call what I do informed opinions, because the research goes into my opinions. There's a lot of talking to sources, experts. And so that's what brings me to the topic today, the very real and inexorable relationship between climate change and migration. And for a while now, I have been wanting to write about this. I remember, I really recall the first time I read on this nexus a couple of years ago now. I recall a deeply reported series in the New Yorker in the spring of 2019 about Guatemala, and the so-called push factors that were driving migration from Guatemala, primarily here to the US. And at the time, as you may remember, there was, we always talk about surges, migration surges, but at the time there was really a lot of people coming from Central America. And so that really was the first article that I read that exposed that connection in a pretty powerful way. And let me just step back a little bit here, because the thing about migration that people tend to miss a lot is that the reasons why someone decides to leave, and this is what I write in my column from August about this topic, that the reasons that why people decide to leave their homeland, they're incredibly complex, and different factors intersect at the same time, like poverty or persecution. So in other words, migration is deeply multi-causal. So obviously, if you ask 10 people, who are immigrants, why did you decide to leave? You may get some convergence in their answers. 3 or 4 people might say, well, I left because I wanted a better job, or I was poor and I wanted to be able to make a living, or, I was under the threat of gang violence, or my partner was abusive. Some of these issues or factors are grounds for asylum, for granting asylum to someone under international laws, right? But typically what happens in our system, when people come, you usually have to ask the question many times and in very complex ways. Like when you ask someone that shows up at the border seeking asylum, an officer might say, why are you here? And the person may say, oh, I didn't have a job, or I lost my job. And then that claim gets immediately denied. But in reality, you need to get deeper into that question and say, well, why didn't you have access to a better job? Why is gang violence so prevalent in this region? And that's when you get to the broader, more complex web of macro reasons of why people leave, which is government corruption or impunity, which is classic sort of reasons in these countries, right? But there are factors like climate change that exacerbate these other pressing factors like poverty. To me, though, crucially, what that New Yorker series did was that it showed very persuasively that, how climate change was pushing people. And so it showed essentially the example of this village in the highlands of Guatemala, and it was people who depended on crops, a very specific type of crops, like a special type of corn that can only be harvested in that climate. And so suddenly they realized that the changing climate, in this case, I think it was suddenly they were having more frosts that there used to be. And then that was wiping out entire harvest, or less rain or unpredictable rainfall, or new type of insects, pests that were killing the crops. So what would happen was the farmers would leave. And naturally, this didn't happen overnight. This was just one example, but it showed in stark detail how this dynamic looks like, right? In fact, there have been warning signs, I think, in this particular case, and this is what this piece does. Even the Guatemalan government had warned about the changing climate in this particular region as early as 2014. So again, for me as a writer, I started thinking about climate change and migration as someone who follows the topic of immigration. And it was then that I thought, this is important. This needs to be reported on. It's really, really urgent. It just so happened that in the summer of that year, 2019, I had the chance to travel to the region for the first time. I visited Honduras and El Salvador with a group of advocates and policymakers from Boston. And it's such a misunderstood region that there were so many topics that I wanted to write about. I had like a long list of things that I actually still refer to, because there's nothing like going to the source of a particular issue, right? To try to understand it. And so, I think among other things, I think I wrote about abortion rights in El Salvador, which, are basically non-existent. If you know anything about El Salvador and abortion, is that it's one of the worst countries, and with the most draconian laws against abortion. It actually criminalizes abortion. So then, last year, there were back-to-back hurricanes in Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua that also created a mass migration. This in the midst of a pandemic, right? And so as a writer, I kept always sort of following that narrative, that dynamic. But I knew that reporting on this intersection is just, obviously it's urgent, but it's at the same time, it's an issue that needs a lot of time. There are basically columns that I can write in a couple of hours. But then there are some that I need to make about 10 interviews with experts or sources. And I knew this one was about one of those. The other alternative is that, again, and maybe this is getting too technical into, what goes on into writing, maybe it's too jargony, but like I also needed a news peg, meaning, something that's going on in the news for me to make the topic relevant enough to capture the interest of readers, right? And so again, during the summer, I also learned that the Biden administration, so as you know, when the Biden administration took over from the Trump administration, one of the first things they did is that they signed a bunch of executive actions. It was similar to what Trump did 4 years ago, except in the other direction. And Biden just signed a bunch of executive orders, many of them geared toward undoing what Trump had done in many different arenas, primarily immigration, but other arenas. And in one executive action, there was this hidden nugget in which Biden was directing his administration to prepare a multi-agency report on climate displacement. And so that was actually kind of major, because it was sort of like the first time the government was sort of recognizing at that high level climate displacement and climate migrants. So ideally that report, multi-agency report, the Secretary of State was going to be involved, obviously DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. But the idea is that this report is going to have policy proposals to extend and recognize formally, those displaced by climate change and how we can protect them, how the US can protect them. So I started to call sources and people in that space, found out that a nonprofit, the International Refugee Assistance Project, they work in the refugee and asylum spaces. They were working in their own report, and it was sort of a preemptive publication to send a signal to the president and his administration about which direction they better go in terms of adjusting our refugee and asylum laws vis-a-vis the climate change, phenomena. This report, yes, the Biden administration supposedly was going to put it out in August. They have blown that deadline. We're still waiting for that report. It's still being, expected. I actually was looking this morning when, if something had changed in terms of the deadline, but I saw nothing, and I think it's still forthcoming. So, I took that report from this nonprofit as my opportunity to write a column on it, and really by stroke of luck, when I published when I was writing that column, that coincided with the release of a landmark United Nations report that was written by the world's most renowned scientists, warning that the Earth climate is warming at a faster rate than previously thought, and with greater and more widespread consequences. So that also gave it more urgency and more weight to what I was writing about, which again was very sort of like 30,000-foot view of the issue, right? But I also wanted to talk about what the US should be doing about it, right? Like, what are the policy ideas that we need to be supporting, which again was informed by expertise, by refugee and asylum expertise. I mean, I guess not a lot of people know that our laws, our refugee laws, were written decades ago. They have never been updated. And the reality is our world has changed so much that people leave for many different reasons, and that needs to be captured in our laws. So what are some of these ideas that I explore briefly in my column where, you know, obviously we have the capacity, the US has the capacity to expand programs for migrants and refugees and asylees. For instance, we can use and expand the use of TPS, which, if you don't know, TPS stands for temporary protected status. And if you're not familiar with TPS, this is a long-standing humanitarian program that allows certain citizens of other countries to stay here. It allows our government to protect them, to keep them here, because a natural disaster or a civil war or some other catastrophe makes it impossible for their home countries to absorb them back. And so among the other many reforms floated is to write new guidance for immigration officers and immigration judges so that they can properly evaluate climate-related events as they are assessing asylum claims. And so this last part is very important because, as I was saying earlier, the reasons why people migrate are very, very complex, and it takes a lot of nuance in figuring out why. And so, for instance, and our system is not equipped to do that. First of all, most people who come here seeking for asylum, they don't have legal representation, obviously. And so typically these are things that you would know, you know, if you're consulting a lawyer or someone who knows these nuances. And of course, you know, they don't have access to that, right? They are fleeing, they are vulnerable. So for instance, I'll give you a couple of examples in the way our system fails to capture people who may be eligible for legal protections. So domestic violence or gang violence, right? So gender-based violence is grounds for asylum, right here. But sometimes, you know, the officers are not equipped to handle that very, very sensible topic. And so someone who shows up at the border, a woman, you know, she fled her village in Honduras because her partner was abusive, but maybe she lost her job also because of that. And that was a triggering event that led her to leave. When she shows up at the border, the way the question is phrased, she may say, oh, I left because I lost my job. And so then that in and of itself, you know, creates, immediately she gets rejected, right? Whereas in reality, the underlying event was the domestic violence. Or, you know, the other thing that keeps happening, especially with all these climate-related events, is that someone might say, you know, I left because my home was hit by a landslide, or we had to leave because, you know, we lost our home. We didn't have a place to leave. So, but why did that happen? Because of a hurricane, because of a climate-related event. And so again, our laws are not equipped to do that. And the reality is that all those things, we can do that. We are the richest country in, you know, on earth, and there is room for everybody here. And there is room to uphold this legal responsibility that we have under international asylum and refugee, you know, notions. And what we don't have is the political will, right? And which I can spend probably hours talking about, but we can absolutely absorb more people. Instead, when it comes to migration, our government is all about illegal versus legal, about deterrence, about jails, about national security, you know, because more illegal migration equals more detainees, you know, which is more profitable because we have a massive deportation apparatus in this country, which, you know, part of it is private. And so anyway, I can spend, that's a separate topic. But, you know, I will leave you, I will end with just one last example. Look at Haiti. We were just dealing with a massive influx of Haitians at our border, and how are we treating them? Haiti has suffered the unimaginable. An earthquake a few months ago that was followed by a tropical storm that wiped out homes. And we're basically sending them back. We have sent thousands and thousands of them back right now here under the Biden administration. So again, climate change creates migrants, it displaces people, and we just need a better system to recognize that uncompromising reality, because it's just not going to get better. So I will end here, Rudy, and maybe open it up for questions.
Okay, Andrea, if you can moderate the questions. Marcela, I read the comments that people post after you publish anything, you know, and
I never read them.
Well, I wanted to ask you, how do you cope with that? Because sometimes they are very hostile, but there is like a constructive criticism, a reasonable position against immigration, you know, that you can say, yeah, I can engage in dialogue on this position.
Well, of course there is, but you know, there's good faith criticism, there's good faith feedback, and almost always that doesn't show up in the comment section of the articles. If someone does have a good faith criticism or good faith argument to engage with, they usually reach out to me via email. And yes, sometimes there are, and I'll give you examples. For the one that people always go to is this idea of like, well, you know, that there's a pie, that there's, you know, the zero-sum game, that the limited pie. We're a country of laws, and we have to have rules, and we have to have, you know, and I find that that's disingenuous, because we can have both. Those are not mutually exclusive concepts. The concept that of the zero-sum game is what I have issues with. And you may say that there is a zero-sum game, but that is a willful limit that you have put in your mind because of ideological reasons. And that is what people sometimes don't want to engage in. Because if you believe that borders exist to limit people from entering, to limit certain people from entering, then that's ideological, is it not? Or maybe we can engage them. Maybe it is not. I will be open to hearing that. But again, sometimes people don't want to argue or admit really other truths behind their arguments. And so there is good faith arguments, absolutely. But like I said, it usually doesn't happen in the comment section of the Boston Globe. It's mostly, I can tell you that there are many, sometimes I get a lot of hate email, but I also do get once in a while feedback that is constructive and reasonable and also decent, you know, or polite. That's the other thing, because civil is what I would say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. You grew up, are there any, Andrea, if somebody has any question. Okay, you grew up in Monterrey, which is, how far is it from Laredo border, from the Laredo border in Texas?
It's 2 hours by
2
car.
hours, yeah.
So we used to go all the time there to the border, even though I did not grow up at the border. We used to go all the time for shopping. You know, we used to stop on the other side of the border. So I'm very familiar with how it's changed.
Andrea, Corina, and I traveled the entire Arizona Mexico border like a week ago on a COVID vaccination campaign, and what surprised us was the fluidity of the border. For instance, people that were working in our program, their office is in Arizona, but they live in Mexico. So they come back and forth every day. The merchants in Nogales, on this side of the La Línea, they call it, on this side of La Línea, they were complaining that because of the border closure, they are not getting any business.
Yes, right.
So,
that's something that people don't realize. The border is closed still. It's closed. This is why our asylum system is suspended. We are effectively not, well, I shouldn't say, I guess for generally, because we are taking in some cases, but it is closed. It's the so-called Title 42, which, you know, I will not get into the details of that policy, but it was a Trump era policy that was triggered by the pandemic, and it hasn't been rescinded. And there is no reason why we're using a pandemic to prevent people from crossing the border. People, like you said, it's porous. It is absolutely porous. It's fluid, the border. And again, not only that, but we are preventing people from exercising the legal right to seek asylum because of the pandemic. And again, there's no public health argument. I mean, you should all know this. Not anymore, right? Like the threat is not coming from other migrants. You know, COVID is not coming in through the border. And so it's just this tool that is being misused even by the Biden administration. So it is astonishing how many people don't realize this dynamic, like you say.
Listen, when I invited Marcela to join us, she said, I am very selective. I am very, because now for Hispanic Month, you get so many invites to go and speak to so many places, and she decided to join us. I want to tell you, Marcela, I've spoken to you about JSI. We have an international and domestic division, and we have a robust climate change business work group. Panos leads I think that Panos leads the international, and Terry, my friend, she's in the domestic, and she has a question in the in the comment box. She said, "We can thank you enough for sharing so much valuable information, Marcela. She's asking, are you also covering climate migration within the United States from region to region and within communities due to fires, flood, etc.?" She's asking if you are.
This is a very awesome question, because it definitely is on my radar. I have not written anything, but please, this is another thing I was going to mention here. I hope you can see me as someone who can reach out to whenever you want to talk about, or just be I'm always looking for people, experts, sources to talk about all these things. I would love to be in touch with you, Terry, about this domestic climate displacement, because it's real, it's true. I mean, what's happening in California, it's very real. And so that is also happening. And we know that, we know environmental justice, right? Like, who gets more affected by these events is people, low-income people, poor people, immigrants. And so I would love to tackle that topic. And if you and I can connect later, I would love to collaborate and hear what you guys have to say. There's research, if there are reports, if there are people I can talk to, because that is an incredibly rich topic that's only starting to come up to the surface.
Terry, she's going to say, when she meets you, and Marcela's going to say, are you willing to be on the record?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Rudy, I wouldn't put it that way, but yes.
Well, yeah, when I visit you, as I always say, Marcela, this is off the record.
Listen, that's very, very smart. A lot of people don't realize that.
Right? Yeah, that's
I already have plenty of records on me.
Thank you, Terry. Very nice to meet you. And I look forward to being in touch, because it is a very, again, underreported topic that I love to, get my hands on.
So, Marcela, I cannot thank you enough. I just want to give my peers and my friends a flavor of the things that you do, and you get a flavor of the things that we do here. I will send you the comments from the folks, so that you can read them. People are very grateful and very happy, and thank
you. I just put my email in the comments in case anybody is interested to reach out. I'm always free and open and willing to hear from experts, and it sounds like there's a lot in your organization that I can tap into for my work.
So, Marcela, on Friday, Hector Sanchez Barba, he's the president of, him? Well, he's the president of Mi Familia Vota.
Yes.
You know everybody. We know everybody. Yeah, so he's
It's my
gonna
job.
be, yeah, he's gonna be in on the Friday. So guys, if you can join us, it's gonna be about the Latino vote. It's very interesting, the things that he's doing, and it's only 30 minutes. So I will send you the link if you want to see it, okay?
Thank you.
Marcela, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I hope it was informative, and I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.